Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm Dr. Anthony Mazzella. On this channel, we go beyond labels and symptoms to explore the inner, often unconscious, emotional world behind narcissistic and related personality patterns. In these short clips from the full podcast, you'll get a clear, compassionate, psychodynamic insight into behavior. Here's a short clip from the podcast that highlights what this looks like in real life. Finally, in terms of the core experience, let's think about the ego organization. Identity remains cohesive. Affect is regulated, again, through defensive control. Reality testing remains more or less intact. In other words, his in-laws are not plotting against him so they could spend more time with his wife. But in contrast with the borderline organization, identity is unstable and fragmented. This is often what we call identity diffusion. Like what this would look like just very practically. What kind of wife is she? See, that's where he begins to lose a sense of himself and of others. What kind of wife is she? Or what kind of husband am I? And all that begins, his whole identity begins to be called into question. And therefore reality testing becomes compromised under these stressful situations with rapid, again, those early level defenses that I mentioned earlier, with splitting and projection and projective identification. And things become very concrete as well. So that's part of the reality testing being lost. In other words, what that means is that experiences and perceptions quickly become absolute and literal. Again, I know I referred to this in an earlier episode, but that's the literal mode versus the representational mode of functioning. Others are experienced as, here's the splitting, all good, all bad. Either you're with me or you're against me, right? My wife was with me yesterday, but now she's against me. And the in-laws are against me too. There's a subjective feeling. The feelings are what? The feelings are treated as objective facts rather than internal states that could be reflected upon. See, that's the loss of reality testing. That's the loss of the capacity to think that I mentioned earlier. So in this example, this fellow was able to talk and recognize a feeling of exclusion, not being the center of his wife's attention. And he didn't remain rooted in his own reality and just remain angry and blame her and talk about how he's being attacked and look what she's doing to me and look what the in-laws did to me and so on. With borderline organization, you get a more urgent sense of this kind of rigidity, this fixed way of thinking about their own reality. There's no movement there. And there's an urgent sense of collapse. There's imminent danger, right? And you get a feeling when you're with somebody like this that you really have to hold this person together. It's a feeling of, they get this feeling too, like I need to be held, or you feel like I need to hold them or they'll fall apart. And by the way, sometimes you do see this with suicidal threats or gestures or severely dangerous behaviors that they engage in. They engage in extremely risky behaviors. And this emerges here at this moment, not as manipulation in the usual sense, but as a desperate attempt to communicate unbearable psychic pain. That's the collapse of the psychic structure, again, that I mentioned earlier. And it's their bid to secure immediate containment when these internal structures have failed them. And they can get attainment because if there's a suicidal gesture or risky behavior, someone may take more of an interest in doing what? Being there for them, holding them. Now, with the narcissistic organization, the intervention often aims to what? To do what? We're going to name the injury and make the withdrawal, the retreat to the couch, more thinkable. So in other words, that we can begin to think about this together without shaming it or confronting it too directly. So an example of this may be something like this. It seems like when you no longer felt central or important in that moment, something in you pulled back, almost as if staying engaged would have meant tolerating a feeling of being unimportant or overlooked. Now, if this appears to be more borderline in nature, the intervention shifts toward, I keep mentioning this, but this is so important, containment and stabilization. So the goal is to stabilize somebody like that, right? Not to, but you know what? In a way, they're very similar because we still want to slow it down. And I would say that. I would say, let's slow this down for a moment. We're here. We have time. And we can hold this together. Let's go back. Let's go over it again, step by step. I really want to understand what happened when. And then here, you can fill in the blank. But we go back to the moment where they begin to have a feeling of whatever it may have been, of dysregulation. Emotions start to get heightened, right? That's what we want to get back to. What does this say psychodynamically? What I'm saying is, in my work with these individuals, that I have to temporarily lend them my ego. In other words, they borrow my ego. This is what I called an ego supportive approach in a prior episode. So my ego can replace those internal structures that have collapsed. So now there's an external organization, temporarily, right, that I become the thinking function. I help them re-engage by way of doing it with them, a reflective capacity, which gets them into a more regulated state of mind. I become the timekeeper. Remember I said, let's go back. Take a moment. Think about it. When did you first start feeling this way? So I become the container because that psychic structure is no longer containing them. You are effectively saying, I will hold the structure until you can take it back. That's what you're saying. If you're with somebody that you know or someone close to you who decompensates in this way, you're not saying this literally, but that's the message that you're giving them, that I'm going to hold this. And I trust that together we'll figure this out, and then you will, your structures, your capacity for reflection will come back online, which, by the way, typically happens once they get reconstituted. In a borderline configuration, the response would look very different. Rather than withdrawing quietly, this guy would cling, pursue, or position his wife to take care of him. There's some sort of or some form of crisis that's designed, either consciously or unconsciously, to secure immediate attention and containment. A sudden medical issue, incapacitating pain, a migraine headache, or an emotional collapse that requires caretaking. He would not just be sitting quietly on the couch. That image alone is distinctly on borderline, if I'm making that clear. Another important indicator of borderline organization emerges after the attention is secured. When the care is offered, when the partner steps in to regulate, soothe, or stabilize, like I was just describing with the act of containment, he may become critical, rejecting, or push the caregiver away. The very person he urgently needed moments earlier now feels intrusive, inadequate, or suffocating. This reflects the core, again, what we call in my field, this is the need, I'm quoting it, the need-fear dilemma that's very common in borderline organization. But that's a story for another day. I'm going to go into that in more detail. That's a whole episode on its own. Now that we've explored how affect and identity show up differently in narcissistic versus borderline patterns, let's pause and review what we've covered and why it really matters. The crucial point is in the micro moment, right? The split second before anger, panic, disintegration, dysregulation, and withdrawal takes over. It's in the moment that support, whether from yourself, a partner, or a therapist, can make the biggest difference. Stabilizing a fragile sense of self, restoring internal structure, and preventing escalation. The focus here isn't on analyzing or processing every feeling right away, but on noticing early signals, offering containment, and helping restore some kind of inner balance. Asking yourself, or guiding someone, what was the very first sign? Not the anger, but the moment that I started to feel unimportant. This allows reflection before action. By the time anger or panic is fully expressed, thinking is gone. You're already in that dysregulated state. Something has already happened. Catching it early shifts the task from reacting or acting out to reflecting and restoring a certain balance. At this stage, an ego-supportive approach matters. That was me, what I mentioned earlier, lending my ego, reflecting, thinking, slowing things down, lending structure to a collapsing internal system, holding space, pacing the moment, and offering containment. This is what helps someone regain internal regulation before emotional processing can take place. And by the way, I just want to remind you, this is one perspective. If you stay tuned, I'm going to go into other perspectives, other theoretical positions, or other theories on how we help somebody in this moment. Finally, if you're listening and recognizing this in yourself, feeling panic, the urge to cling, or there's a feeling of desperation or even a falling apart, just noticing these early moments and taking steps to steady yourself is actually the first step toward reclaiming control over your inner emotional state. There's still so much more to explore about this topic and related dynamics. If you're finding this discussion helpful and you want to learn more about the various facets of narcissism and related personality organizations, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video clip. If you want to do an even deeper dive, check out my podcast. I go into far more detail there. Okay, until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now.